A common misconception is that water is consumed and just goes away. The reality is that water flows. It flows through the soil, it flows through the atmosphere, it flows through rivers, through pipes, through our bodies. And that means that as water flows, we have different opportunities for its reuse. Water resource management is the discipline and the process of looking at the water that exists in the ground, in aquifers, in rivers, in lakes, in the atmosphere, and trying to understand how we can utilize it for human need, human uses, and try to minimize the damage on its quality and quantity, especially when considering the future, considering future generations. So water resource management, to distinguish it a little bit from water service management, is when you try to understand within a given territory or for a given community, which could be small at the level of a village, or it could be huge at the level of entire nations or entire continents, what the water available to you is in terms of quantity. So how much water do you have that you are able to access, and what the quality is and how much treatment it requires and how much investment in terms of energy and material it requires to be usable. To distinguish it a little bit from service management, where we look at how these water resources that we have allocated for use, so we've said, as a society in a given locality or in a given geographic scale, we've decided that we're going to use 100,000 cubic meters for domestic use in a particular city. Water service management is about taking that allocation that has been decided at the level of resource management and understanding how to efficiently and equitably and effectively deliver it to the population, if we're talking about domestic use or urban use. In industry and in agriculture, it's quite similar, but rather than thinking about individuals, people, families, households that use that water, we think of companies, we think of enterprises, we think of cooperatives in some cases, farmers. We think of private entities whose use of water is motivated more so by economic factors. So there, the relative cost of water service provision takes on an even more important role. On a global scale, we have two major dimensions of the water resource management problem. And because of the distribution of global wealth, we feel these problems, or we address these problems very differently. So the first part of the problem has to do with the resource itself. So due to climate change and anthropogenic stressors, human use, we are quickly depleting the amount of fresh water that is available for our use in terms of quantity, that is regularly available for our use. But we're also significantly impacting its quality. So as humans, we are causing these stresses, but also we are stressing the climate. I'm not going to get into how that works, but basically climate change is significantly also impacting the availability and the quality of water. And almost equally importantly, it's impacting the predictability and reliability of weather patterns, and as such, the water that we expect to be available. So to give an example, if we previously had very predictable or relatively predictable seasons, for example, in our region, we would know that our rainy season is from, say, September, October until March, April. And we would say that precipitation varies year to year, but it's a certain amount of precipitation. And we would say that throughout the year, we have a fairly normal distribution of precipitation, with very few days where we'd have acute precipitation, which would flood roads and cut off other roads in the mountains and so on. With climate change, you end up in a situation where perhaps that season is shorter. It rains and snows over fewer months. And perhaps that precipitation is much more acute. So it rains and snows in fewer hours and days within that period, which means you have more floods. And it means that the snow does not quite settle and sit on the mountains as much as it used to. It also means that you have a lot more soil erosion. Essentially, everything is faster. Things happen more intensely and faster over shorter periods. This is a problem not just because of the amount of water that is available, so the amount of water that is available obviously reduces because of this new pattern, but it also means it's harder for us to predict and anticipate that precipitation coming in and understand where that water is going to be and when and how we're going to use it, which forces us to adopt more infrastructure-centered approaches by saying we need to capture that water as quickly as possible. We need to drill more wells. We need to build more dams. We need to build more storage facilities. We need to build more infrastructure to capture that water because we're afraid it's going to be lost to the sea. The problem with this reasoning is that it creates a cyclic problem, because the more we do that, the less nature or the less the environment around us is able to mitigate the damage caused by climate change. To give a simple example, the more we build roads and channels within roads, stormwater channels, to divert water away from our towns and cities and cars, the more that water that otherwise would have reached forests and agricultural areas and just barren soil, the more that water is captured and quickly sent away to sewers, to the sea, or to anywhere else. So by trying to divert the problem away from us, for example, the problem of stormwater, we end up increasing the amount of losses that we have as a result of more intensive rain. When we talk about climate change, when we talk about the environmental catastrophe that we're in, we often focus on carbon. We talk about CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, but for those of us in the water sector, we genuinely believe that there's been a carbon fetishization process happening over the last years. And the reality is, almost equally, water is a problem. Water is a problem because the disruption that I mentioned earlier, the disruption of climate patterns, means that we have less water available in the soil as an average, and we have a disrupted water cycle. If you remember the water cycle that we had in our geography books as kids, that would show the water evaporating from the sea, raining over the mountain, and then going down. We've disrupted that cycle to the point where our forests are suffering, our agriculture is suffering. Basically, anything that is able to sequester carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is also suffering. So on the one hand, we're overproducing greenhouse gases and releasing them into the environment. And on the other hand, we're depleting the ability of that environment. So if the problem is climate change, if the problem is at a global scale, honestly, it's quite difficult to understand how we're going to solve it. There's a very good chance that we won't be able to solve it. And in any case, the solution does not come from a single sector. It has to be a much wider, much more integrated solution across different sectors. If we narrow down our focus to problems that are more relevant to our region, so we are impacted by climate change. If we think of Lebanon and its immediate neighborhood, we're not major contributors to climate change. We're not major contributors to that stress that I was talking about. However, we are major contributors to the damage of our own environment. And we are also suffering from the other part of the problem, which is more related to water resource management for services and water service management. Our populations suffer from significant scarcity of water Scarcity defined in economic terms, meaning that is not accessible, it is not equitably distributed, it is highly contaminated, and that results in economic and public health related losses. This is not a problem we have alone. This is a problem shared by most of the global south. So if you think of countries from China to Vietnam to India to Pakistan to Nigeria to Brazil, all of these countries, all of the world outside of the global north, outside of Europe and North America, have a significant water service problem that is getting worse. To solve this problem, we need to improve water resource management and water service management, which means we need to improve our governance, improve our management, mostly improve the human element more so than infrastructure. This doesn't mean that infrastructure is not important. We need a huge amount of infrastructure to meet the demands of our populations. But the human element, the governance and management element is much more critical. When it comes to innovation, we seem to have in the global south a bit of a problem innovating for ourselves. What I mean by that is that we look at the cutting edge of technological advancement and try to ask ourselves, can we do that? Can we build the next water metering device? Can we build the next sensor, the next piece of equipment that is highly advanced, that has been recently invented and marketed around the world? And the truth is, our markets, our countries might not be ready for this product. In other instances, we innovate for much more basic humanitarian needs. So we try to think, what is a product that we could bring to market which would satisfy the need of a refugee next to a river to meet their water demand. And so we invent a bottle that filters water from that river so that it can be used for drinking and cooking. And I'm not saying these things are not important, but they don't help us transition out of the situation of suffering independence. So what I would urge is for innovators to think of designing and planning and innovating for transition. And what that means is designing solutions and products built for the next 5 to 10 years. So built to help our countries and our communities deal with the impact of climate change and anthropogenic stressors, deal with the current lack that they have in access to equitable and efficient water services, but also solutions that help them transition out of this situation to a more developed and more advanced situation. So some key areas where innovators are required, for example, especially in the global south, are in utility management, for example. Water utilities, water service companies need innovations that match their specific contexts and their capacity to absorb new technology, the skill set of their workforce. And so what they need are solutions that use some of the cutting edge technology, of course, especially what has become much more accessible, things like satellite-based services, artificial intelligence, cloud services, etc. These are all things that are quite useful to utilities. But they need solutions that are absorbable. They need solutions that look at the actual pattern of use in their communities and the possibility of these communities to adopt solutions. If we want to give a few examples, in Lebanon we have the problem of non-revenue water, basically the problem of, in simple terms, water losses. And one of the solutions to this problem, or one of the components to the solution of this problem, is installing water meters at household level. Something that's often discussed in the water sector in Lebanon. Now, the current way in which we receive water is through gauges or valves. So just little control devices that control the flow, control the amount of water that goes into our households. We collect that water in tanks, and we use water from those tanks. The solution of installing meters everywhere is very desirable because it allows us to bill people to make them pay for just the amount of water that they use rather than pay a flat tariff, which incentivizes them to use less water. It also helps us understand what amount of water is actually delivered to people and what quantity of water is lost in the networks. And we have a significant problem of water loss within the networks. But the water meters themselves, if they are to be reliable, will probably cost somewhere in the order of $100, $120 per device. The private sector is rather limited when it comes to the water sector. And this is because we have a tendency, or we have a real fear in the water sector of the specter of privatization. It's often discussed, it's often contested, but there is a real problem of the extent to which the water sector is already privatized and to what extent it can continue to be privatized. So I think there is a near consensus that basic urban public water services should remain public. But that doesn't mean that for the private sector and for innovators especially, there isn't room for new products and services that have a significant market. So first, I think as a thematic, we have the thematic of waste to resource. We generate a lot of sewage. We poop a lot. We are a large population for a relatively small country. We are highly urbanized. This means that we collect a lot of sewage in mostly dysfunctional wastewater treatment plants, but that means there's a lot of potential resources to be extracted from that waste. So wastewater, once properly treated, consists of water, which you can reuse in agriculture and environmental rehabilitation, and if you clean it to a certain extent, again, in domestic use. But it also produces sludge, and that sludge is basically a bunch of chemical compounds that can be reused as fertilizer or as compost, but that takes some processing. Now, the current model is quite linear. So the way we manage our sewage is basically we just send it to rivers, valleys, and the sea. And best case scenario, we treat it to a certain level through wastewater treatment plants and then still toss that clean water and sludge back into rivers, valleys, the sea, and landfills. This is one of the areas that there's a lot of room in for clean tech, because companies can come in and say, we will try to treat that sludge as a private sector to reuse as organic fertilizer. And there's already a couple of companies that have already started to do that. One of the things that companies run into is the lack of supportive legislation. There has recently been an adopted standard by Lebanon for sludge treatment and reuse. I think there is in the pipeline a standard for wastewater also treatment and reuse, especially reuse. And this opens up the legislative framework, it opens up the legal framework and the opportunity for private actors to step in and start generating revenue from resources derived from this waste. However, if companies don't step in and start innovating and start bringing to market certain products and services related to these subsectors, there will not be pressure on the government as a whole and relevant ministries and agencies to move further in this legislation and start issuing permits, licenses, permissions basically for companies to reuse this waste as resources. So it's important that we understand this dialectic between evolving policy framework and the private sector coming in and innovating and bringing certain solutions to market. Another area in which we can invest a lot, and I mentioned this earlier, is innovation for utilities themselves. So if in the wastewater sector, there's a lot of potential for waste to resource. In the potable water sector, for example, there isn't much space for that. There isn't much space for the private sector to come in and directly interact with the water service. However, there are areas where the utilities are suffering. For example, I mentioned earlier non-revenue water. We know that there is funding coming there are donors and there are international agencies that are helping the water utilities of Lebanon improve its non-revenue water. And they will do that through, for example, performance-based contracts, where contractors will be invited to improve the state of efficiency and equity in water distribution networks in return for compensation and even bonuses. It would be wise for Lebanese companies or companies based in Lebanon to start producing service packages that are innovative, to start looking at financing models that are innovative, to start, yes, importing some technology, but also assembling technological solutions that are fit for purpose for Lebanon. And if this happens in the next few months to few years, there is a market for these companies to actually operate even in the potable water sphere, however, not in providing the water service itself. There's the one area where I think there has been significant innovation is irrigation, so agriculture water management. There have been a number of companies in Lebanon that have improved things like precision irrigation, things like more efficient application of water to soils and to plants, satellite-based monitoring of water requirements across fields. So there are areas where there has been this investment, maybe more so than other fields. And it's particularly because the public sector is rather absent from this field, and the private sector, be it an individual farmer or major companies, are quite present and active. So they have the flexibility to operate, and the market is somewhat mature.